Welcome to the Easton Book Festival. I'm really glad that you decided to stop in for our author interviews program with the Greater Lehigh Valley Writers Guild. And my name is Andy, and I'm the director of the festival. We are sponsored by the Lafayette Humanities Center, the Greater Easton Development Partnership, by WDIY FM, Lehigh Valley Public Radio. And today we're going to have author Michael Daigle interviewed by author John Evans. So you can learn a little bit about Michael and get a sense of what the scene is like in the world of the Greater Lehigh Valley Writers Group. So now I'm going to turn it over to John Evans.
Okay, good evening or afternoon, whatever. My name is John Evans, and I'm a board member of the Greater Lehigh Valley Writers Group. We refer to ourselves as GLVWG. That's our nearly unpronounceable no-vowel acronym. And our mission is to provide our members with a network of support and resources in the fields of writing and publishing. We started out way back in 1993 with a few women meeting in someone's living room to discuss writing. And since then, we've grown into an organization with over 170 members. We are now a 501c3, and we are extremely proud of our annual Right Stuff Writers Conference, which draws people from all over the country. For the Easton Book Festival, we're offering a series of author interviews called GLVWG, Getting to Know You, that will feature some of our published authors. Not only will you get to know them, but you will get to know that GLVWG, what GLVWG has done for them as writers. Tonight, we have with us Michael Stephen Daigle, who is a relatively new member, and he will be interviewed by a senior member of GLVWG who joined shortly after the group formed in 1993, and that would be me. Michael Stephen Daigle grew up in Northeast United States, from shores of upstate New York to the woods of Maine and the piers of New Bedford, Massachusetts, writing all the while. He and his family now live in New Jersey, close enough to GLVWG headquarters to become a member. And he is a graduate of Binghamton University. His first job was picking blueberries in Maine, and his last job was a 33-year career as a newspaper writer and editor. He wrote his first novel at 22 and a second at 24. The second one became the first book of his Frank Nagler mystery series, which include The Swamps of Jersey, 2014, A Game Called Dead, 2016, The Weight of Living, 2017, and last year, The Red Hand. He also writes general fiction, has self-published a collection of short stories in 2012 called The Resurrection of Leo. Michael, good evening and welcome.
Hello, John. Thank you very much. And thank you to Andy for sponsoring this. We attended the first Easton Book Festival, the live one, and I had a good time, and we're interested to see how this one's going to go. So I'm hoping it goes well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think let's start the interview. Let's set the Wayback Machine to your early days. You wrote your first novel at 22. Do you remember the exact time or circumstance where you decided you wanted to become a writer?
I just started writing. When I was in high school, me and some friends were, among the 68 billion kids who started garage bands. And we started writing our own music, and I tried to write lyrics and couldn't do it. So I wrote stories about being in a band, one of which put us in a bus touring the country. And then the Partridge Family came on ABC TV, and there went my career. I just been writing. I just picked it up one day and said, I can do this. Let me see what I can produce, and just started writing stories and wrote stuff through college, managed to stay in college long enough to get a degree, wrote last minute theses that somehow the professors liked, and I moved on. And then I just started writing. The first book that I wrote when I was 22 was about a boarding house in Syracuse, New York, where I lived one summer. Had two main characters, a kid who wanted to become a newspaper guy, which actually at that time wasn't me, and a war veteran who was suffering from what today we would call PTSD. And it really was about sort of the loneliness of living in this old ramshackle Victorian house and what that meant. I put it away. I kind of showed it to people, sent it out to a couple people. They didn't like it. I sent it back, and then life moved on. I've read it, started reading it recently, and it's not as bad as I thought it was. So, you know, and then I wrote a game called Dead, which became under a different title, the first Frank Nagler mystery. That started with, I found a newspaper item about a break-in. Somebody broke into a house, stole a bunch of stuff, and never got caught, but that the break-in had been reported. So I said, well, let me write this. So I wrote 8 paragraphs about some guy getting on a bus and breaking into a college dorm. And then I said, well, what happens if you see somebody? So I put somebody in the room. And then that became like an 8-page short story called Killer. And then from there, I wrote the first Frank Nagler mystery. Frank showed up, his friend Leonard showed up. He's a blind bookstore owner. The reporter Jimmy Dawson showed up, and the guy who broke into the house eventually became the serial killer, Charlie Adams. And that was who's sprinkled through the books, and that sort of became the first book. And after that, I've been writing ever since. I have a trunk full of stuff that's probably got 75 manuscripts in it, from, you know, attempted long stories to short stories to whatever. It's just, you just do it. So.
I was taken by the fact that you were a journalist for 33 years. Writers write in spite of all the impediments life can throw at them, career, family, school, pandemics. And you were a journalist for 33 years, and you must have spent hours banging away at a typewriter, and then you went home and to relax wrote novels banging away at a typewriter. I have a few friends who are journalists and authors, and it seems a common complaint is the fact that after spending all day typing at the office, they came home and they were too burnt out to continue working on a novel. That doesn't seem to be the case with you, or was it?
I used being in the newspaper business as simply a learning experience to learn how to write. And I was writing stuff outside. Fortunately, I had my scheduling was pretty much a night schedule. So I pretty much had mornings that I could write, and I went until I got a family, and then you spend your time with your family. But the difference between writing those first books when I was 22 and didn't know anything about writing at all, or much about life in general, was that after I got into the newspaper business, you're forced to learn stuff that you don't really think you need to learn, because you're out in public, you're out covering the public. You learn how people speak and walk and talk, and you learn how to formulate stories in a moment's notice, because you're either dictating them over a phone or you're sitting at your desk with 20 minutes before a deadline writing a story. But I managed, when I was working in Maine in newspaper, I managed to publish a couple of short stories and worked on the Nagler books as I did it. It's just something I do. And when I'm not doing something else, I'm at my computer. So. You're muted.
John,
I have to remember to do that. You managed to crank out a series of books, your Frank Nagler mystery series, and how much of that came from your newspaper coverage of crimes and that you put into your fiction?
A lot of the background and a lot of the town setting reflect places that I've lived in. I've lived in a lot of places that look like Ironton, New Jersey. It's an old factory town. It's had good times and bad times. It looks like Phillipsburg. It looks like Easton. It looks like Bethlehem. It's the main town that I based it on was Dover, New Jersey, which was an iron manufacturing center for a long time. But I've lived in all those places that have had lots of big factories and seen the industries fade. It's the kind of town that you can find anywhere in the country since World War II, as old industries faded and new ones came to place. And then you cover town government and county government, you go to courts and all of that stuff. And the whole breadth of whatever is going to happen in a town happens in front of you. And so you write about it, and a lot of it sticks. And there are particular instances where you take pieces of a particular story that you wrote and maybe work them into the novel as fiction. But it's just the idea that was there, and not necessarily the actual case, because you're writing fiction, not nonfiction. So,
well, your main character, Frank Nagler, is he based on a real person, or is he a pure creation of your imagination?
He's pure fiction. He showed up in the first book. In the first book, he was retired because when you're 22, why not? You got a blind bookstore owner and a retired cop as your main characters. So what the heck? And I realized, but I also realized that I was going to write a series about this guy. So I had to de-age him pretty quickly, because when you're 75 in your first book, you might not make it to the second book. So he's pure fiction. And he's evolved over time. When I figured out, when I was rewriting a game called Dead into the Swamps of Jersey, I started, the transformation of that occurred back in the late 90s, when Hurricane Floyd came through central Jersey and flooded downtown Dover. There was 5 feet of water in the door. I couldn't leave town because the roads were closed. And I walked through parts of East Dover where houses were underwater, and a photographer and I were walking through the streets in waist deep water, trying to find people who were still in their house, even though they were practically underwater. So what I realized is that I came up with this character, and he's the last honest man in this town. He's the stalwart, and he constantly brings his strong ethical belief against all of the nonsense that goes on, and gets beat up about it. It happens that I killed off his wife in the first book. And that became a problem when I wanted to do the prequel, which was what The Red Hand is, because I already knew how to do that, or knew what was going to happen. I wasn't sure how to do it. And it took a long time to write that book, because I knew everything. And you can't write something that you know absolutely everything about. So I started and stopped it about 4 different times till I got it.
You say that Frank Nagler captured your attention in your first book. Have you ever dropped a new character into a scene and they kind of took over and stole the scene, so to speak?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. It happens. It happened in the third book. It's called The Weight of Living. It's about it. The simple version is that they're trying to find the name of a young girl who was left standing in a grocery store dumpster in the middle of the night in March, wearing a t-shirt and shorts and no shoes. So the setup is that they had to go to court to get temporary custody of the girl so they could actually begin the process of finding out who she was. And the scene was supposed to be 6 paragraphs. Nagler would be waiting out in the hall. The social worker would come out, nod her head, and say, "We're good. Let's find out who this girl is." Out walks Sister Catherine. She's an old nun who knew him when he was 6 or 7, knew his wife, and everyone calls him Frank, and she calls him Francis. And she carried a cane from an accident that she had. She's about 75 in this book, and periodically when she wants to get his attention, she whacks him in the shins. She changed the entire trajectory of that book, and I've used her in 2 other books since. So
yeah, that's magical when that happens. It really is.
It's like, oh, hi, who are you?
Yeah. So when you have a novel and an idea for a novel, do you plan it out in detail before you touch the keyboard, or do you just dive in and let the story take you for a ride?
I dive in. Although I don't spend any time outlining. I sort of know generally where the story is going to go, but I just start writing because I sort of pick my way through it because I like to be surprised when stuff happens. If I sometimes think that if I had planned the weight of living to the nth degree, Sister Catherine wouldn't have happened. And then and that book would not be the same book without her. So you kind of plow ahead, and as you plow ahead, and I write forward and backward. So I'll write a scene and then I'll write 40 pages ahead to see if it matches up, and then I'll go back and fix it. And I leave notes to myself, this happened here, you've got to fix that later on, that kind of thing. It's probably chaos, and I'm sure not all writers can do it that way, but that's the way I work.
You said you write notes to yourself. Do you have any techniques that you use to keep track of the character's eye color or the car he's driving, his address, telephone number? Any systems that you have discovered?
Yeah, I'll have a file where there's certain things that I have to remember to use because I've used them before, and so you make a list of, Frank in the swamps of Jersey, Frank Nagler wore a long sort of duster type raincoat. I had to make sure in various scenes that that's what he was wearing. Because he's not a sporty dresser and he wasn't going to go out there. But yeah, you kind of keep track of that so there's some consistency because these stories don't take place over years. They take place within weeks. I mean, they're mysteries, so they take place in maybe a couple of months. You can't have your guy or any of your characters completely changing their wardrobe inappropriately to the season. So you got to kind of keep track of that stuff. And it's a lot of also keeping track of where they go. I have about 4 places in the fictional town of Ironton, New Jersey that are key places that show up in all the books. And you kind of make sure that if something happened on page 20 in this place, that in page 120, that you go back and make sure that you have the reference to that place. It's keeping track of the details. So
if I could jump in with an idea I use is I use my telephone contact list and enter them in as contacts and grouped according to the title of the book, and then I add notes as I go. It's
sure.
Yeah, it's a great way to keep all those little details separate.
Yeah, you don't lose track. I mean, because I found reading through the second manuscript, you'll find that you changed the name of a minor character. He's Michael on page 27 and he's John on page 36. So yeah, you had to go back and fix those things. But that's why we have copy editors.
So I guess everyone's heard of writer's block, but it can happen in many degrees of for instance, it could be just a momentary block out at the keyboard, or it could last for months of years of inability to create anything. Have you ever struggled with writer's block? And if you did, what did you do to overcome it?
I think I don't have writer's block in the sense that I can't sit down and just write something. What I learned in the newspaper business, because you're writing on deadline, on very short deadlines, is as you're heading back to the place that you're going to write, you prepare what you're going to think about. And I'll make a note if I finish a chapter or something like that. Now I'll make a note at the end of that chapter so when I open up the file, there's a message to myself. Car crash. New body, something like that, as just a memory jogger. But I tend not to. I think being in the newspaper business, writing all that stuff on deadline and also handling things on deadline, you talk yourself past that pretty quickly because it becomes muscle memory. And after, when the newspapers I worked at, medium-sized newspapers, we were writing 4 stories a day for the most part. And later in our career, when they were shedding staff, we were writing 6 stories a day. You really didn't have a lot of time to ponder how you're going to do it. You just sat down and worked. You train yourself to sit there and write. And now that now that I'm not in that business anymore, the bigger issue is procrastination rather than writer's block. So.
Well, yeah, coming up in November is the NaNoWriMo, the National Novel Writing Month, and people, pledge to themselves to write 50,000 words by the end of the month, which sounds like takes the kind of discipline that you were just talking about to, sit down and keep writing. Have you ever tried that?
I haven't tried it. I think mostly because the timing of it was that I was either done with something or was halfway through something already. I know friends of mine who have done it and produced work that the following year they polished up and published. It's a viable way so you can learn the habit of writing. I haven't done it because I sort of have the habit of writing every day. How much I actually get done depends on what I have to do is sort of create what that project does is you create yourself a phony deadline, so I need to have 2 chapters done in 2 weeks and something like that. And you write to that point. And then I'm a little bit behind on getting the 5th book and the Daigle thing done. I don't have a definite date, but I would like to get it finished by the end of the year. So that kind of motivates you. I don't want to be writing the same story in January, so I'd like to get it done in November. Because I want to do something else in January.
Yeah. One of my favorite experiences with GLVWG was at a writers conference, and they had a session that was called Midnight with the Detectives. And they had 2 New York City detectives. They were retired, and they gave writers coaching on police procedures. And we sat around in the bar of the hotel at night, and writers asked them all kinds of questions that were really, you started to wonder about the people you were sitting next to. How do you sink a body and to keep it underwater? And how can you steal a body from the morgue? And you must do a lot of that kind of research for your books too.
Yeah. A lot of what I learned about police procedure, I learned in sitting in court hearings or hanging around the police department. When I worked in Dover, the police department was 2 blocks away. So I could wander in there and talk to the cops all the time. And I covered dozens and dozens of court hearings of all types, from everything from civil lawsuits to murders to all of that. Plus, you cover everything from fires to accidents. I covered a leaking natural gas truck in the middle of the night, and we all just sat there and watched this thing burn because they thought it was empty, and it turned out to be full, and it was throwing flames all over in the middle of Newton. It was 12 degrees, and so in those moments, you watch what the police do, you watch what the fire people do, and ask questions about why are you doing this, why are you doing that. It's the same thing with covering politics. We covered one time in Maine, we covered a sort of an election drill by the state Democratic Department. They were running a drill to see how they could get voters out to the polls. And I talked to one of the national organizers, and I said, why are you doing this here of all places? And he said, because it's practice. We need to practice getting the vote out. And you watched how they organized their streetwalkers and their door knockers and all of that. And you record that. You record it in a news story, and then you record it in your own memory. With the internet now, you want to learn how to do stuff, you look it up. All of it's right there. And it's just a matter of poking your way through and getting the details right. For example, in this new book, I blow up downtown Ironton. And for research, I'm looking at a Lehigh University study on confined accidental natural gas explosions, and where they looked at 2 gas explosions, one in Allentown and one in Harlem, to measure the force of the blast, the distance that the debris flew, and all of that. And I'm trying to incorporate what that thing says into this thing. So when I write about the debris field and the impact, that it's as close to fact as possible, you know.
Now, you said you're working on a prequel, and your 5 novels stretch over what kind of time period?
The Red Hand was the prequel, and I moved it back 20 years to when Frank Nagler was a rookie cop, just married, and handling the biggest murder case in the city's in 100 years in the city. Ironton is one of those towns that has layoffs and stuff like that. So he had been in the police academy. He had been on the police force for a couple of months, and they promoted him to detective. And the first case that he handles is a serial killer case. And he spends a lot of time going, I don't know what I'm doing. How am I supposed to do this? And the story for him is about how he grows as a detective, because by the end of the book, he's a different guy than he was in the first page. He's also dealing with the death of his wife. And all of those, the weird part of writing The Red Hand is that pieces of that story have showed up in 3 other books by now. Everyone knows his wife is dead because I said so in The Swamps of Jersey. And there's a couple of moving scenes of him at her old house and her at her gravesite and things like that. How do you write that story so it's fresh? And that's what took a long time, because I'm thinking, I know this story. How do I write it? And I started literally writing it from the beginning, and it was boring and it was awful. And I ran into a guy at a show in Philadelphia. He was a music producer, and we started talking about what we were doing. And I said, I'm having a heck of a time with this book. And he said, what are you doing? I said, I gave him that description. He said, I have music. I have musicians come in with a hot sheet of music, and they can't play it. I take the sheet away, put them in a closet, and let them play for a while, let them jam, and then they come out and they play the piece, and then it makes sense. He said, your problem is you're trying to tell all of your characters what they have to do exactly when they have to do it. And he said, I'm not a writer, but I know that sounds wrong, so you need to stop doing that. So I went back, and he was right. So instead of starting the book at the very beginning, I started it in the middle. It starts with the 4th death, and now I've got room to go backwards and forwards and tell his story and the impact of all of this murderous rage on the city. And a couple of people who had read all of the books were a little leery that I was going to write a prequel. And when they got done with it, they said the thing that surprised them is that even though they knew the story, they were drawn into this story because of the way it got told. And I'm going, oh, thank you. Because my biggest fear is that, nobody's going to read it because they already knew it. And I'd given away everything. And I guess I didn't. So,
excluding the prequel, would all your other books in the series stand alone, or do they depend upon reading the first one and going in chronological order?
now you can read them out of order, because one of the things as I planned this series, I carry over characters. Frank Nagler carries over, Jimmy Dawson, the reporter, carries over. Leonard appears in 3 of the books. Lauren Fox, who's Frank's current companion, appears in 4 of the books. But I made a distinct effort to make, even though some of the background carries over from story to story, each one has a different crime scheme and a different set of circumstances. So they're standalone books. You can start in the middle, and it will make just as much sense if you started at the beginning. What I'm trying to do with this 5th one is that there has been an underlying long-term storyline that sort of runs through all of them. I'm going to blow that whole thing up and make all of these connections that were sort of hinted at through all of these other stories and end that long storyline with this book so that I can have Frank do something else besides try to figure this piece out. So there's a sort of a thematic joining of the stories, but each one is a separate story from the other. Different criminals, different circumstances, the same place, but different circumstances. So.
I have a question that kind of ties in the last couple of topics we've had, and that is, keeping details straight on characters and their what they look like and what they dress like. With the police procedural things, jumping around from different time periods, do you find yourself maybe making references to a procedure that is an anachronism?
In the Red Hand, I went back to the time where there were payphones and fax machines, and police carried radios. They didn't have cell phones. The computer systems were very sketchy. And one of the running jokes in the story is that every time Frank needs to make a phone call, the payphone's busted. In the other books, they are in the new version of a game called Dead, the villain is an internet terrorist. His name is #Armageddon. And he taunts the police over the internet, and they use street video cameras and all of those types of techniques that are current to track movement, to find him. He's a hacker. He hacks cell phones of a couple of kids and gets them blamed for blowing up a building, and it's stuff you can read in the daily newspaper and read about online about how they do it. You try to keep that up. With the new one, one of the things they're looking for is video from all of these security cameras and ATM phones and things like that might show something that happened around the explosion site before the explosion. So they're gathering all of that stuff. So you try to keep that stuff modern as best you can, but not heavily. It's you don't spend 2 pages talking about how they work the camera, but you use the information that you can get and make it evident.
Yeah. Have you ever made a mistake, either with technology or something that you put into print that you wish you could erase?
Yeah. In one of the characters that runs through the first couple of books is a guy named Chris Foley. He's initially he's Frank Nagler's partner, but by the second book, I figured out that he's a sneaky, underhanded, ambitious, do anything I can to succeed kind of guy. And I realized I was listening to the audio version of the weight of the swamps of Jersey, and I realized that I made him and Frank too friendly, because they're not friendly. Nagler is trying to solve these crimes, and Chris Foley is trying to undermine the investigations as best he can because he has another stake that's hidden all the time. And I realized that to do it, I'd have to go back and rewrite a couple of scenes to make Foley as much of a bad guy as he is in the other books. I'm too nice to him. And I may actually have to do that, but he's in jail now, so I'm not sure it matters.
You just mentioned audiobooks, and that piqued my interest because I've often wondered how those come about. Is it does your publisher pick out the narrator, or do you have any say in the production of the audiobook?
I have, in the contract I have with them, it says that if they do not begin working on an audio version within like 2 years of the publication, that I can take it over. And I tried to take it over and realized that I didn't know enough about it to make it work. So we work as a partner now. We did the first one a couple years ago, and we got 10 or 12 readers. It was fun listening to all these guys from the Midwest trying to sound like they're from Jersey, because they kept slipping into their Southern accent and things like that. This last one, we found we had like 20 readers, and we go through ACX, which is attached to Amazon, because Amazon also owns Audible, so it's all the same group. But they have a pretty simple system. You put out what you put out your price range, you put out the book, you throw a sample up there, and they read it. The hard part, quite honestly, is having to listen to 20 people read the same 2 pages of a story back to back, and you realize all of the little mistakes you made in the dialogue, because the same words, the same 500 words coming back at you all the time just drives you crazy. But we found a guy who read The Red Hand, and my publisher, Imzadi Publishing, has used him for 2 other books that they have on their catalog, and he's going to do the next 2, and probably the 5th one as well once I get it written. So we'll have one consistent voice through all of those, because we realize it's another avenue. I have had friends telling me that they want to read my books, but they only read audiobooks. And so I sent them a note and said, well, I have 2 of them. You can now start reading, it's a different way of reaching a new audience. And if you find the right guy, they have an audience themselves. So you build on their audience,
Yeah, I've used audiobooks a lot. I have several acres to mow, and that's
Yeah.
one way to kill the time without going crazy.
Absolutely.
And I think it's very important to use the same reader for the same characters. I was very disappointed reading an author who had recurring characters, and the reader was a different person, and I thought, wow, this isn't working for me. So
Yeah. We knew that this guy was great. There's an old Italian jeweler in 2 of the books, and he shows up in The Red Hand, and he's an old country guy. His grandfather opened the jewelry store, and Manny comes over and he glad hands. And if you're in with Manny, he calls you Frankie. And he just had this old world style of the guy perfectly. And I heard that and I said, yeah, this is the right guy,
And you got to request him from then on, or was
Well, the publisher and I agreed that if he's willing to do it at our price, he can do the next 2. So price is a lot of it. And we had some high-end guys who were just fabulous, but we couldn't afford them,
Yeah.
Including some, named actors and Broadway actors and things like that who do this on the side. They could probably knock it out in 3 days and, make themselves $2,000. And it's like, well, good for you,
Yeah.
No.
Let's just change base a little bit here. With the go to social media, that's such an important part of an author's self-promotion and a way of staying in the spotlight. But it's also a time hog. And it steals time from your creative efforts at the keyboard. So how do you juggle those 2 conflicting worlds?
Well, I created a website, michaelstevendaigle.com, and I link it to most of the prominent social media sites, Facebook and Twitter and all of that. So when I post something, it goes out and gets posted elsewhere. I join a couple of writers groups and drop in on them, online writers groups, and drop in on them periodically, but don't spend, those are the real time suck. You could spend all day trying to answer questions and waste a lot of time that you should be doing something else. Marketing is hard. And I've been experimenting with a couple of small sites that are pretty inexpensive, but generally produce something like 15 or 20 different pieces of marketing a month on places like Facebook and Twitter. But they're relatively inexpensive, so you can keep up with them. And there's a couple of other those that I'm probably going to look at. Those have been oddly effective. I know when I change the content that I'll see some traffic. But I've got to redo my website so it's more useful. But it's a good place to start. It gives me a place to go without having to do 14 different drops on it every single day. So
you said you do some writing every day.
Mhm.
Do you do some social media every day too as part of your schedule?
Yeah, we all surf the web. It's unavoidable. But also, but you know what? Part of that is as an old newspaper guy, I'm an info junkie. So I go on news sites. I want to read, the good reporting on what's going on in the world, and I also read, I'll start reading science stories and agricultural stories and anything that looks of interest. I read forestry stories because you never know when you need to know something about cutting trees down, things like that. It's a lot of if that stuff was available 30 years ago when we were in the news business, it would have been great. But now it's available and you just use it as a resource. You have to limit your time. You have to say, this is enough. I got to go back to work now.
Yeah.
Like everything else. So.
Well, you mentioned joining writers groups, and you're with one right now, the Greater Lehigh Valley Writers Group. What are your expectations for your involvement with us?
I joined it right after the Way of Living was published, and I attended the writers conference the next year, and that was a great experience. And started going to the Writers Cafe regularly when it was over at the Palmer Library. And then I had 2 surgeries in 18 months, and then COVID showed up, and the writers conference was canceled, and I was pretty immobile for about 2 years. And now I'm getting back into the writers cafes, which we do virtually every week now. But even before that happened, I was able to go to a couple of schools that the group had posted and say they were looking for writers. So I was using it to expand my contacts through the Greater Lehigh Valley. And now that I'm not having surgery and we're moving into this other thing, it seems to be working pretty well. And I anticipate more contacts and using the resources on a more regular basis now that I'm not housebound. So
That's good. Well, we're glad to have you aboard, by the way.
thank you.
I think we're running close on time here. As a closing, do you have any final thoughts or words of wisdom to anyone who is contemplating a career in writing?
There's 2-part question. If you want to be a career writer, be independently wealthy. If you want to start writing, just start writing. I tell people, go home, write 5 sentences. Those 5 sentences are your sentences. Nobody else has written them before. Write 5 more the next day and 5 more the next day. And at the end of 20 days, you've got 100 sentences that no one else can claim. That's your start. And I tell them, don't worry about the niceties. Don't worry about grammar and punctuation and point of view and descriptions. Just write stuff down. You'll learn the rest of that by doing more and showing it to people who have had the experience. They can guide you into making and crafting it in a better way. But if you don't start, there's nothing to craft. I look at it and say, think of yourself as a knuckleball pitcher. Knuckleball pitchers were told through their entire career, you need to throw a different pitch because that's a terrible pitch. Yet there's 5 knuckleballers in the Baseball Hall of Fame and probably a dozen in the last 50 years who have made meaningful careers throwing a knuckleball because they stuck with it. And that's what you have to do as a writer. You decide that you're going to be the writer and go do it. And don't second guess yourself. If you think about all the things that you could do wrong as a writer, you'll never write anything. So think that you're going to do it right, because there's 100 people who are going to tell you you're doing it wrong, but you have to believe in yourself enough so that you can write those 5 sentences and then 5 more and then 5 more.
Well, thank you very much. That's very good advice. And I guess that about wraps it up for us. Thank you for sharing your writer's journey. It's been a real fast hour, since it was not an hour. And Andy, do you have any? I don't quite know the method of going about buying books through the festival. Could you explain that?
We will set up a buy button on the book festival website is the answer. So there'll be a button underneath this video.
Okay.
So, but thank you so much, Michael, and thank you, John. Be a knuckleballer. I think that's good advice. And thank you, everybody who came to see this author talk on the Easton Book Festival presented by the Greater Lehigh Valley Writers Group. And we're going to have a couple more of these interviews with John Evans checking in with members of the Writers Group. And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andy, for hosting. John,
sponsored by WPIY, Lehigh Valley Public Radio.
Yeah.
For our sponsorship.
Okay. Thank you both for the great time. It's wonderful to come on and have the chance to talk about this stuff. And John, thank you for your prep and your questions. Very thoughtful stuff. And Andy, I'm glad to see this is moving forward. We're looking forward to having it succeed and then doing it in person again. Find a way to mix it. So.
Okay. Well, good
Cool.
night.
Good night. Thank you all.
Yep.